and welcome back to Seagull Central. My name is Adam MacDonald and welcome to my YouTube video. Thank you very much for coming to this channel where today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, something a little bit new for this channel. We're going to go a little bit more tactical, a little bit more in depth, and we're going to break down the Newcastle win at home. As I always say, if you find yourself coming back to this channel and you haven't done it already, if you're a regular viewer, a big Brighton fan, and you've not subscribed to this channel, please hit the subscribe button, turn your notifications on, or if you're a brand new fan that's just stumbled across this, this is the best Brighton social media channel out there. Regular content, in-depth content, debate, analysis, reaction, all the different things. I try and bring it to you as often as possible. We're going every day at the moment. Sometimes it's a few times a week, sometimes it's every day. It's a lot of content, so if you're a Brighton fan, this is the place to be. And what I want to do today is dig into the Newcastle result. Obviously, on Sunday, the day after the match, I kind of gave my instant post-match reaction, speaking about who I thought played well, the reasons why I thought we won it, the things that impressed me, this is my kind of instant emotional and kind of the praise and negatives after the game. Today, I want to try and get into the actual tactics of how Brighton did it. What was it tactically that we were seeing from the Albion that allowed us to stop Newcastle's threat, but also break them down and play through them? Because to be fair, I think to give Fabian Hürzeler some credit, this was a win which was, once you dig into it and once you look at kind of how Brighton did it, it was a well-crafted win. It was a tactically kind of crafted when there was a real element of understanding specific ways of playing that were clearly made to play against Newcastle's weaknesses, play to Brighton's strengths. And I think this has been something I've spoken about before, my kind of concerns around whether Brighton play enough of a clear system, whether you're seeing him and Fabian Hürzeler be the kind of difference maker in matches. I do still have some reservations around that. But I think in this instance, in this game, there were clear moments just from doing a little bit of research around this game, watching back clips, thinking around the way Brighton set up, and listening to the quotes after the game. You're able to kind of really see what Brighton were trying to do and what Fabian Hürzeler's attempt was to try and do in this game. So let's get into it. What I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to show a few clips, a few little tactical boards, but I'm not going to try and make it too tactical heavy. Because personally, it's not something I'm massively passionate, or even like I'm not a massive tactico. But also, I think there are clear things that we can see from this game, which I'm going to try and display through visuals throughout as we go. Let's get into it. So, I think the first thing we've got to talk about is the kind of way that Brighton dealt with Nick Woltemade. It was something they did really, really well. Obviously, you've got to think about Nick Woltemade. Scored a lot of goals since he joined. Is it maybe 5 goals in 6 games, 4 goals in 5 games? He's been banging them in, and he scored a very, very good goal against the Albion on Saturday. Now, what we can say is this was, I think you've got to say, a bit of a freak goal in terms of Van Hecke and Dunk doing an excellent job in terms of pinning themselves to him, reducing the impact that he had all game. And the moment the ball comes into his feet in that second half, it is a complete freak incident. And all the ways that Brighton had been defending against him had been in an attempt to isolate him, to prevent him from getting as many touches on the ball as possible, giving him as few touches on the ball as we possibly could. This goal came from literally just kind of one brilliant, unbelievable touch. And I don't think it was necessarily Newcastle kind of really breaking down Brighton's ability to stop him. What I thought they did really well, and if I show some of the graphics now, is I thought the way Brighton isolated him was really clever. He had one of the centre-halves pinning themselves up against Woltemade, which was namely Jan-Paul Van Hecke in most instances, and then Lewis Dunk would sit in behind, essentially to mop up anything that would come in. So what this might look like is the ball, Newcastle were kind of forced to go long by the way that Brighton pressed. The midfield stepped up and pressed Newcastle's midfield and defence. Nick Pope would often opt to go long. Woltemade would have an option of himself up against Jan-Paul Van Hecke. Now, what the case would be is either Jan-Paul Van Hecke would be up in the air trying to fight Woltemade, trying to win that header. If not, he's got Lewis Dunk literally sweeping up behind him, able to kind of counteract that threat. And I think that was something that Brighton repeatedly did. If you look at all of the options in the way that Brighton man-marked Woltemade or dealt with Woltemade, a lot of it was around man-marking. It was around Van Hecke or Dunk, one or the other being really tight to him, the other one stepping back, often being behind one another as opposed to kind of next to each other, and waiting to see what happened. Another thing that I found was really effective as well for the Albion was when those kind of launches came in from either defenders or the goalkeeper or out wide, it was actually about stopping Woltemade even getting any contact or even not even trying to win the header from Van Hecke or Woltemade. It was about manipulating Woltemade's movement to stop the ball even going near him. The ball would go over Woltemade and someone like Lewis Dunk behind would be able to sweep up the ball, just receive the ball as it had been launched over. Woltemade would completely miss it due to Van Hecke's kind of marshalling. And then Lewis Dunk would be able to start attacks from that moment. And I think this was a really useful way that Brighton were able to build attacks. What we also saw was that the fullbacks stayed very narrow. We had De Kuyper or Kadioglu in the first 35 minutes, and then Wieffer on the other side coming in very, very tight, making things very compact, and even stepping into midfield in moments to really create a bit of I've written here, a bit of a screen in front of the defence. What we also saw is that Ayari and Belabor, their ability to kind of really shield that midfield, alongside Wieffer, who was able to support in that. We essentially in moments had three midfielders because of Wieffer's ability to step in. And what that did is it essentially closed the majority of the passing lanes into Nick Woltemade, and it meant that Newcastle really had only one option, which was to go long. So kind of every time we gave him the opportunity to kind of get the ball into him, we just completely isolated him. So I thought it was a really, really effective way of dealing with that. What I've got to say is I think we've spoken about Dunk, we've spoken about Van Hecke and the way they were really good. I do also think the Wieffer role and the midfield role was a really, really important part of that. The way that Newcastle set up meant that their midfield was quite high up at times, and there was a lot of space in behind them. In attacking areas, it gave Brighton a very good opportunity. I'll get onto that in a minute. But what it also meant is that by De Kuyper or Kadioglu being on the field as well as Wieffer, they were able to come into midfield. And look, I've spoken about Wieffer before. I've spoken about my hesitancy around his him playing at right back. I think what we saw against Newcastle was a good tactical reason as to why Wieffer plays in that position. Not only is he a decent one-on-one defender at right back, he does an okay job. What it meant in those moments is we had a bit more of a screen in front of Lewis Dunk and Jan-Paul Van Hecke to deal with what was a very, very complicated threat in Nick Woltemade. Let me move on. I want to talk about the midfield and how, in terms of an attacking sense, Brighton were able to break down Newcastle. Now, obviously, we've spoken about the way that the midfield were able to defend against Woltemade and support Duncan Van Hecke in kind of allowing Duncan Van Hecke to be the linchpins that maybe started the attacks or dealt with Woltemade. Actually, I think Fabian Hürzeler did a really good job at setting up this side to deal with the gaps that were created by Newcastle's midfield. So if I try and explain this to you. So Newcastle's midfield trio, Joe Linton, Guimaraes and Tonali, they left large gaps between the midfield and defence. If you look now, for example, there are big gaps in that space between Newcastle's back four, with Byrne, with Botman, with Thiaw, with Trippier, and that midfield three. They're a very flat midfield three, which meant at times Brighton were really able to overload that gap in between, that little half space between the defence and the midfield. I think the way Brighton set up clearly meant that was the intention of someone like Fabian Hürzeler. So, for example, Mats Wieffer, the way he stepped into midfield meant that we could overload that position. We could overload it with Rutter. We could overload it with Ayari, Belabor, Minteh. In the second half, Kadioglu. That was a really good example of how his role and his position was really, really useful. Getting as many bodies as we could into that position meant that we were essentially catching Newcastle catching them out essentially. Ayari was really good at dictating the tempo. A lot of it came from Jan-Paul Van Hecke and Lewis Dunk in that deep-lying position. But what it meant was, because Newcastle's midfield was so flat and there wasn't one sitting deeper, there wasn't one sitting a little bit closer to the defence, actually Brighton the way we set up meant that a lot of us, a lot of the players stayed narrow at times. Obviously, you had Minteh out wide, but Kadioglu wasn't afraid to come into that kind of central midfield. Don't know what you'd call it, that kind of number 10 kind of roaming area. You wouldn't be, be seeing Wieffer. They'd obviously be seeing Rutter there. But what we could do is we could overload that. So it allowed Brighton to kind of bypass any press that we were having, but also allowed Brighton to kind of play really, really strong vertical forward passing. You got to think the first goal that came from Georginio Rutter's ball into Danny Welbeck was an example of how Brighton played brilliant through those passing lanes and allowed the ball to go from Brighton's defence into that space in the kind of number 10 position behind the midfield of Newcastle that was very, very flat. Able to get the ball into that space where it was overloaded with a lot of players, as you can probably see, through really crisp, clear, vertical passing, direct passing. Jan-Paul van Hecke's ball into Rutter and then another one straight into Welbeck. These really, really strong passing lanes, utilising that space in behind Newcastle's midfield was a really good example of how we were able to break down, that midfield, but also then immediately create 4v3, 5v4, 4v4 kind of attacking positions. I think we've also got to talk about the way that Kadioglu and De Kuyper came on. I think those two linked up brilliantly. I think the way that you saw them interchanging was fabulous. And I also thought the way that either one of them tucked into midfield made it really useful for Brighton. It wasn't about staying high and wide all the time. We had kind of Minteh to do that up against Dan Burn. Those two were supporting the midfield in that kind of press, in that overload that we were trying to do in behind the Newcastle midfield, but also they're able to link up so brilliantly on the left-hand side. So it was a really, really comprehensive win. And actually, Brighton created a lot of chances where they probably could have gone and made even more chances in this game. They could have scored even more goals. The amount of chances you think about in that first half particularly, and in the second half, the Ayari chance. There were a couple of Ayari chances, weren't there? Minteh had a couple of chances. Georginio Rutter had one. There were multiple. Maxim De Kuyper had a couple of shots. And what it did is it meant Brighton could get in behind Newcastle a lot of the time. Were able to really, really wear them down. And ultimately, I think if they hadn't won this game, it would have been a very, very difficult one to take because Brighton played brilliantly. I think tactically, Fabian Hürzeler got it right. I think he really did get it right. And I want to see a little bit more of this. I think, I've spoken a lot about wanting to see patterns of play, and maybe that's the wrong way to focus on it. Maybe it's not so much about finding patterns of play, but actually being able to see the way that the game is being played. We've spoken about it before with Fabian Hürzeler around how I think he is maybe a bit more of a horses for courses kind of manager, who'll play different players for different games, will have a different tactical setup for a different game. It's not necessarily about playing one way like under De Zerbi and we play that, do or die. Actually, it's a little bit more about taking each game as it comes. I think that's where having players like Ayari is so good, someone who's so versatile but also can be so incisive. I think we saw in this game the qualities that he had on show, and Baleba obviously being back to his best. So a massively impressive performance, and from a tactical perspective, a unique one and a very impressive one as well. Let me know what you think. Did you think, to what extent was this a kind of a comprehensive victory? I heard a couple of people saying it's one of the best performances they've seen in the AMEX era. Where does it rank for you? How well do you think Brighton dealt with the Nick Woltemade threat? And also, would we like to see that midfield kind of getting forward and pressing in high areas a little bit more going forward? Because it was obviously so effective against Newcastle on Saturday. Let me know what you think. As always, if you've enjoyed this video and you've got this far in the video and you haven't already subscribed, please hit that button, turn your notifications on, and you'll never ever miss a video. You'll be back for all the biggest, all the best Brighton Hove Albion reaction out here on YouTube, and the most in-depth, the quickest, and the most exciting out there. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate your view very, very much. I'll see you on the next one. And as always, up the Albion.